Welcome to Minutes by Board Cycle, where in each episode we pack the insights from one of Australia's boardroom leaders into just a few minutes. Today, join host Richard Conway as he interviews Carol Schwartz, member of the board of the Reserve Bank of Australia and chair of the Women's Leadership Institute Australia, on the state of diversity in the boardroom as we enter 2025.
Welcome to Minutes by Board Cycle. I'm your host, Richard Conway, and today on the podcast I have the privilege of interviewing Carol Schwartz. Carol's the chair of Equity Trustees and a member of the board of the Reserve Bank Australia, the chair of the Climate Council, and perhaps most relevantly to today's podcast, the chair of the Women's Leadership Institute Australia. Carol, welcome to the podcast.
Lovely to be here, Richard, and thank you for inviting me.
Great. Carol, you're a leading voice on issues of gender equality and women's leadership. So today I wanted to talk to you about diversity in the boardroom in particular. And I wanted to start with some data that Chief Executive Women has published about women on boards in 2024, which there's a couple of data points I wanted to let our listeners know about. So the first, there are 13 companies on the ASX 300 who have no women on their board in 2024, which is actually an increase compared to 2023 when there were 11. Whereas across the ASX 20, now 40% of board seats in aggregate are occupied by women. And then the third one is that 202 out of the ASX 300 have women occupying at least 30% of their board seats, up from 195 in 2023. To me, that tells a quite mixed story. But Carol, I wanted to ask you to start off with what your take is on the state of gender equality in the boardroom today.
Well, Richard, so much better than it was when I first started sitting on boards. And, I think that it has been due to the combined efforts of really good women as well as really good men who realise the benefits of diversity. And, we have groups like McKinsey's which show that when you have diverse people constituting board membership, you get much better outcomes, much more optimised outcomes. And isn't that what we want as shareholders? I think that, those 13 companies, and it's great that it's only 13, right? And you said 202 of the ASX 300 have over 30% women on their boards. I think that's fabulous. I mean, look at the progress over the last 20 years. It's been astounding, really, if you think about it. The top 20 companies on the ASX have 40% women on their board. I think they're great moves forward. And the laggards really are the ones who probably suffering, because they're not optimising their outcomes, they're not optimising decisions for shareholders. And I think that shareholders have become very, very aware of the need for diversity. And so they're probably risking losing some of their investors based on the fact that they don't have diversity around the board table.
Yeah, absolutely. And Carol, some other data in the same publication from Chief Executive Women goes into kind of a next level of detail around that. So it's looking at what positions women are in on boards. So that would show that in the ASX 300, less than 15% of women are in chair positions. And then talking about sort of feeder positions to the boardroom in the ASX 300 again, 9% of CEOs are women, although 25% of CEO appointments in 2024 were women. And similarly in the C-suite more broadly, I guess CEO feeder roles, approximately women are making up less than a third of that group. So I wanted to ask you about when it comes to participation in leadership positions and whether you see that as the key priority or something else.
Yeah, that's definitely too much of a gap, Richard. And I think that it's something that when women are on boards that they really focus on, that women within the organisations that they're directors of actually have the opportunity to move into roles where they are responsible for profitability, where they're responsible for leading large teams, and where they're on a path to becoming CEO. I mean, We've got to ask the question, though, Richard, whether we've been viewing too narrowly what that pathway actually is to CEO. I mean, we've had lots of preconceptions about what sorts of qualifications and characteristics a CEO needs. You know, things that I've been reading lately actually question old paradigms around what constitutes a good CEO. And in fact, the sorts of ways women's characteristics and qualities are described within organisations are actually at the forefront of the sorts of characteristics and qualities that we want in the leaders of our businesses. So I think, unfortunately, like everything, this is going to take time. It's also going to have to influence old paradigms and around what constitutes a good leader. But I think the more women we have at the board level, the more we're going to see women coming through in those very senior roles. So I'm really very much looking forward to that. And, you know, the fact that 9% of CEOs are women, being a CEO does not qualify one for a board role. We look for much more diversity than that. We want people who've had different experiences in different organisations at different times of their lives. And that doesn't necessarily mean being a CEO. For example, an entrepreneur founder brings great skills. Now, they don't necessarily have had the formal conservative CEO experience because they've had much more entrepreneurial experience. But I can tell you from my experience sitting around board tables, having somebody who has been an entrepreneur brings just a completely different way of thinking and problem solving to a board. And isn't that what we need? We need a diverse array of problem solving focuses so that we actually hopefully get to the best outcome.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up and ask whether your view is the same around chair positions in boards to what you just said about CEOs. Does the paradigm about what makes a good chair need to change as well? Perhaps there's too much emphasis that you need to have previously been a CEO to take chair roles.
Yeah, well, I think that's totally erroneous, actually. I've sat around boardrooms where the best chair is done by people who've never been a CEO. It's not to say they haven't had, obviously, leadership roles and very senior roles, but they haven't been a CEO and they've been stunning chairs because they bring qualities, characteristics, ways of thinking to a board that don't exist around the table. And they also lead in a way which is incredibly inclusive and which brings out the best in people. I mean, I see myself as a chair as really being a conductor, right? I have great people sitting around board tables with me who know so much more than I do very often about the intricacies of the business that we're dealing with. And I see my role very much as getting the best out of them sitting around the table rather than me pontificating about what my views are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Carol, I now wanted to ask you some questions around diversity in the boardroom more broadly than just gender. And I guess the question is, in general, whether you think organisations are paying enough attention to that broader question. So just as an example, preparing for this podcast, I had a look at what the AICD publishes around diversity, and they have some very deep data around gender diversity on boards, and they've been releasing that since 2016. So there's quite long running. But for example, there's not similar data that they publish around cultural diversity.
Yeah, it's a real shame, isn't it? And also age diversity. I mean, I'm a big believer that you've got to have really effective age diversity sitting around the table. I don't look at TikTok, but I like to have someone sitting around my board table who knows absolutely about TikTok and the impact that it's having on our customers, our potential customers, on the business that we're in, on our staff, and the only way we're going to get that sort of exposure is by having someone around the board table who understands new paradigms that others may not get. So I think for me, age diversity is a huge issue. I also think that cultural diversity is very important. In some organisations, more important than others. But as a general principle, I think it's very important. But for me, the top of the list is actually age diversity.
Yeah, that's a great segue actually to my next question, because that seems to me to be a real challenge. The Governance Institute has some really interesting information about that, which shows that the average age of a director this year is 61. That went up a little bit compared to last year. And if you look at directors under 50 years old, so only 8% of female directors are less than 50 and only 6% of male directors.
I'm surprised with that because my experience has been that the female directors tend to be younger, a lot younger than male directors.
That's absolutely true. The Governance Institute data does show that. But yeah, I guess the question there was, is it the case? I think I know the answer to this from what you said. Is it the case that with age comes wisdom, or where is the threshold there that it's important to bring younger people in for better connection with new paradigms, like you said, but they obviously must have a broad range of skills and experience to contribute to a board?
Sure, absolutely. For me, the threshold is you always have to have younger people on the board because you have to have that exposure. Now, young doesn't mean you necessarily have someone who's 22 or 23, although there could be some circumstances in which you run a technology business and there is a 22 or 23-year-old out there who's been an enormously successful entrepreneur. Why wouldn't you want to harness their skills around your board table? To me, it's sort of obvious. I must say I'm pretty age agnostic. I do believe that time limits on boards are absolutely essential. I know that Catherine Livingstone at the AICD said that she feels that 6 years for a board role is long enough, that potentially 9 years is too long, and I absolutely agree with her. I think you need to be constantly refreshing, regenerating, having new ideas, having new people sitting around the table. Whenever you bring on a new director, you learn something new about the business. You learn something new about the board dynamic. You learn something new about the executive team. It's such a positive process, board renewal, that I'm absolutely with Catherine Livingstone on a 6-year limit as opposed to a 9-year limit.
Yes. And to wrap up, Carol, I just wanted to ask you, what would you challenge boards and chairs to achieve on diversity by 2030 or sooner?
Well, 40% women on boards. I mean, I was a believer in the 40-40-20 rule, right? Because you're not always going to have even numbers, so you can't always have 50-50, right? And you've got to be pragmatic around that. I mean, in some board situations, you might have 80% women and 20% men. Are you going to impose a 50-50 rule on every business? I think that's unrealistic. However, getting back to what we've just been discussing, age, I would really like to see boards opening up to more diversity in ages sitting around the board table. I think that's just as important as gender.